I fell in love with a boy on the internet. And before you judge me, I would not be sitting here talking to you today but for this relationship. My ex-husband and I were recently separated, and I started posting on Tumblr. He was also posting on Tumblr. More specifically, he was posting his poetry. It started out innocently enough. I followed him on Tumblr, he followed me on Tumblr. We liked each other's posts, and on occasion, we would comment on each other's posts. Then one day, we decided to trade email addresses. We started sending each other emails that were so long, explaining our entire life stories to each other. At the time, I was also posting photos of myself on the internet, not something I would recommend in hindsight, and therefore he had a really good idea of what I looked like, and he was posting photos too, and I thus had a very good idea of what he looked like. It soon became obvious that the poetry he was writing was actually about me. I felt like I had to reciprocate, so I started writing my poetry about him. And soon we developed a sort of secret code on Tumblr. Anytime he wrote a poem about me, he would tag it as 4S. S was my middle initial at the time. And anytime I wrote a poem about him, I would tag it 4A, because A was his middle initial. So for several months, we were writing love poems to each other that were tagged either 4S or 4A, and we hadn't even met each other in person yet. Meanwhile, both he and I were growing not insubstantial followings on Tumblr, I think like a couple thousand, which was a really big deal at the time. So all of these people are actually following along in our secret love story. They all eventually knew that a 4S poem was written for me and that a 4A poem was written for him. In the meantime, our emails to each other, our text messages to each other, and even our video calls to each other, they grew more frequent and, dare I say, more urgent. I lived in Chicago, Illinois. He lived in North Carolina. I was in my mid-30s. He was in his late 20s. I was Asian American. He was white. Those first two things concerned me a little bit and obviously made it difficult for us to meet in real life, geography. The third thing didn't really bother me at all until the day we finally met in person. Eventually, I took a little time off of work and I flew into North Carolina to meet this boy in person for the first time. It's this really hot and humid day, and I walk out of this airport and I'm scanning all of the parked cars for this blue Nissan Versa that he said he'd be in. In the meantime, I'm also terrified that as soon as he sees me, he's gonna think that I don't look anything like all of the pictures that he's seen of me and that he's regretting meeting with me. I remember I spent so much time trying to figure out what to wear, and of course I just stuck with something super lawyery, black, and something that I hoped make me look really skinny and beautiful and sophisticated. I had my, Louis Vuitton luggage, which I don't even have anymore, and I had my sunglasses on, and I walk out of the airport and I'm scanning all of the parked cars looking for him, and I see him leaning against this tiny blue Nissan Versa, and he looks exactly like I imagined. He starts walking towards me and I start walking towards him. I'm like, what's the protocol? Do we give each other a high five, a hug, or something even more? We give each other a nice, innocent hug and then we kiss. There was something electrifying about the fact that it was happening in the parking lot of an airport I'd never even been to with this boy I'd only ever just met in person for the first time. So I get into his car and he starts driving me home to his place. And the first thing I see when we drive out of that parking lot is a pickup truck. And guess what's on the back of that pickup truck? A Confederate flag. Keep in mind, I grew up in Chicago, Illinois, in the city and the burbs, so I had never seen anything like this before in my life. And as a person of color, I felt extremely uncomfortable. But when I said something to him about it, his response was, "You see those everywhere," which I think he meant to make me feel better, but actually ended up just making me feel a lot worse. And I think it was that misunderstanding, the miscue between what I was trying to express and how he tried to comfort me that really elucidated to me what it meant to be in an interracial relationship with him. But all of those concerns were completely tamped down by just being so excited to be with this person. Finally, after months and months of sort of leading up to it, and without going into the details, I will say right now, this relationship with this young man that I met on Tumblr, it was everything that you read about. Here's the thing. As a middle-aged woman who essentially married the first boy that she ever dated, fell in love with, or had any type of physical intimacy with, that meant I had a very one-dimensional view about what it meant to be physically intimate with another person and the role of passion in a romantic relationship. I genuinely believed that passion was fake, that it was something that was just in the movies or in romance novels, and that it didn't exist for responsible, contributing adults. He taught me how wrong that was. I learned that passion can coexist with love, that passion, in fact, reinforces love, and that if you settle for a love without passion, you are doing yourself a disservice. For the first time in my life, I learned what it meant to be desirable and loved at the same time. The interracial thing didn't go away. We actually started to make a joke about it. Every single time I flew in to see him, he would say, "Oh, the Asian quota has been satisfied," because I never saw anyone who looked like me anytime I visited him. I grew a little bit self-conscious about it. One time we had just finished eating at Bojangles. If you're from the South, then you know Bojangles, right? And we were in the car and he wanted to kiss me. But as he leaned in, I could see past him at the car parked next to us. And inside of that car were two older white women. And they were staring at us with this sort of horror-stricken expression on their faces. And of course, there's no way for me to know exactly why they were so horrified by us, but I made the assumption that you know I would, which is he's white, I'm not, and we're making out in his car. So as he leans in for a kiss, I stop him and I say, "There's two women across the way who's staring at us." He turns around and he gives them a look, and then he turns right back at me and he looks me straight in the eyes as he says, "I don't give a fuck," and then he kisses me. I think the hardest part about being in this relationship was having to go home, go back to my job, go back to my life in Chicago. I wanted to stay in the magic of Wilmington, even if it was hard being a person who looked like me in a relationship with a person who looked like him. When I was around him, I felt so alive in a way I had never felt in my entire life. I remember once we were driving along the coast, and it was just a beautiful day. And I rolled down the window of his little blue Nissan Versa and I stuck my hand out as if I was collecting the wind in my hand, just like this. And I turned around to him and I looked at him and I said, "You know what? This is the happiest moment of my entire life." I know I'm making it sound like the perfect relationship, but it wasn't the perfect relationship. Sometimes we daydream about what it might be like if we ended up getting married and having babies and raising a family in the home that his father built for them, but ultimately we ended up ending our relationship. Now, here's why I say this relationship literally changed the course of my future. I met him when my ex-husband and I were separated, and it was because I met him that I learned I deserved so much more, which was what allowed me to walk into that divorce courtroom with confidence and say, yes, I am going through with this, which was, as many of you know, one of the most difficult things I ever did in my entire life. A few months after my divorce was finalized, I met Anthony, the undisputed love of my life. And it was because of that moment in the car when I told him, this is the happiest I've ever been, that I now had the vocabulary to understand the happiness I deserved. And as a result of that, I now get to live in my own romance novel every single day of my life. And if you want to know what happened to the boy I met on the internet, he got married. And I hope every single day that he too is living his own romance novel day in and day out. That's the least that he deserves for being such a beautiful poet and for changing my life.